Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start today talking about Tzaraas, Bizman Hazeh or otherwise. It has potential to turn into a series about medical stuff, b'chlal, doctors, pandemics, alternative medicine. We'll see. I guess we'll see where it goes. We'll follow where it goes. Now, I wanted to start discussing the Indian of Tzaraas. Obviously, it's partially related, but also the broader topic. So, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to say this, but I'll just there's a very famous non-Jewish woman by the name of Mother Teresa. I think everyone's heard of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa is like, she became a saint already. The Catholic Church beified her, made her a saint. She was I think an Albanian who moved to Ireland and became a nun, and then moved to Calcutta, India, and opened like many hospice cares for the dying. Now, primarily, who she took care of in the hospice were people with leprosy. Now, leprosy is a terrible disease. You could look it up online, its symptoms, etc. It's a terrible disease, like a fatal disease. And she opened like hospices for the poor of Calcutta, which was a huge, very overpopulated and very unsanitary city in India. And she took care of these people suffering from leprosy who were dying. Now, she raised copious amounts of money over the years. Eventually, like hundreds and hundreds of these places opened, and she has thousands of like nuns working in her thing. Now, Achrei Moisa, there's like a little bit of a second look that people are taking to see if she was really such a big tzaddikus or not. Now, putting aside the fact that she was a big missionary and she was always trying to convert the people in these hospices, but there was a second nakuda that people were paying more attention to, and that's as follows. Leprosy is officially known as Hansen's disease. It was like discovered in 1872. The exact biology of Hansen's disease was discovered in 1872 by a French doctor. And over time, the care for leprosy got better and better. Today, leprosy has come out eradicated. You don't see a lot of people who are lepratic. And there's treatment and there's protocols and etc. But over time, during the 1900s, when her hospices were open, treatment was improving, especially pain management was improving. And in her facilities, they would not try to cure them or to deal with their pain or whatever. And when people would ask her that everyone's really suffering in squalor over here and it's really terrible, it's not, no one's getting, everyone's really suffering, she would say, isn't there something beautiful about the way the poor accept their suffering? It's so reminiscent of the way JC, died on the cross. That was her take on it. And because of that, people today are looking back and saying it seems like withholding available medical care and available pain management from very ill people, because she saw it as some sort of so to speak, like a ruchnistic experience, not a medical condition, a spiritual condition, and the way that they accepted their suffering and dealt with it was like a spiritual reaction, and that was beautiful. Now, what's interesting is that she's really coming from a very religious perspective, because Tzaraas, as we'll discuss now, is very likely a spiritual condition and not a medical condition. So I wanted to talk about Tzaraas in that way a little bit. Now, the truth is that in the earliest translations of the Torah, starting from the Septuagint, from Talmud HaMelech, like the Gemara Megillah refers to, and later Latin translations, the taich of Tzaraas in the Torah was always leprosy. Lepra, which is the Latin word, and then eventually leprosy. The taich of Tzaraas in the Torah was leprosy, and because of that, I think every kid in school probably even still, if they taich this way, taiches Tzaraas as leprosy. Now, the truth is that Tzaraas and leprosy, Tzaraas, as the Torah describes it, with all the simanim the Torah gives it, so nigei habayis and nigei begadim and nigei adam, have very, very little to do with the symptoms of leprosy. They're both skin rashes, or present themselves as skin rashes, but they have very little similarities to each other in a real way. Now, the chayikrim, like different achronim who were into this, spent a lot of effort showing and exposing, so to speak, that Tzaraas is not leprosy. Now, I want to sample from Rav Hirsch in the end of Parshas Tazria, who has a long maracha about this, and just show Pashat a few chilukim that tell you what it is and what it isn't. And then we'll talk about how it sells a chayis today. Now, Rav Hirsch, in this shtickle in the end of Parshas Tazria, he brings this out. He says that people say that Tzaraas is leprosy, and Adarabah, it's a beautiful raya to the Torah's knowledge, is that the Torah understood about isolating contagions. meaning Tzaraas, leprosy. Leprosy is a very contagious disease. It passes, from one human to another very quickly, and therefore when there's outbreaks, it spreads like wildfire. And the Torah understood that you have to isolate people who have leprosy, put them in lepers colonies, make sure they stay away from everybody, which is why the Mitzrayim would go mechutz lamachane, and they couldn't be near their wives, and they couldn't be near their children, and they had to be observed and see if it was healing or not healing, and the size of it, and etc. And people found like some sort of beauty in that the Torah, which was given thousands of years before modern protocols for leprosy existed or were invented, already knew about leprosy. He says Hirsch, it's a nice feeling, but that's b'chlal not what it is. He says it's a toyus. He says in the Torah, isolating them has nothing to do with isolating contagious diseases. And he says, I'll bring you a few rayas, he says. He says, for example, I want to read, he says, Nivchein ata, as hilchas negoim, klaleim prateim ikrim, k'dei lekvayim, yesh hatzdaka lagdarasim takanos ketakanos. Let's see a little the klalim and the pratim of Tzaraas, and see if it matches up with the rules of contagion and leprosy. He says, Tzaraas amitis, which is shchin, einu metame ba'atzma. Shchin Mitzrayim, which was shchin ra shalituchali hirafe, the pasuk says, that Tzaraas was not metame b'chlal. Because the Torah in Parashat Tzaraas says that if Tzaraas is on the whole body, not just in one area, it's not matama. He says, now ask yourself, Hagatzmucha, he says, if Tzaraas is leprosy and it's about contagion, he says, if someone has lepratic sores on his whole body from head to toe, is he less in need of being segregated and isolated? He's more in need. And so the Torah says that's not matam b'chal. It doesn't have to be separated, he says. Another thing he says is, he says the Torah says kamapamim that the michya, which is basar bari, is siman tuma. Like basar that looks healthy, surrounded by basar that doesn't look healthy, is considered Tzaraas. He says that's the opposite of the symptoms. Then he brings another thing. He says l'chol mari ene akayin. The pasuk says you need a kayin. He says if it's contagious and it's just about avoiding contagion and isolating people who have the contagious diseases, so what do you need l'mara akayin? So he says, some people say the Kahanim were just good doctors. That's what the Kahanim were. They were good doctors. But he says, if it's just to avoid contagion, so just separate them. He says, for example, also, Tzaraas, the Mishnah Nagam says, is not metame until Klal Yisrael reached first of all, Tzaraas of a guy is not metame. The Mishnah Nagam says in Parakimel. Tzaraas of a Kav is not metame. He says, it doesn't matter. Contagion doesn't matter if it comes from a Jew or a non-Jew. If it's contagious and you want to isolate a contagion like leprosy, who cares who has it? He says, Tzaraas is ein neheges, at least in the beginning, until Klal Yisrael went to Eretz Yisrael. What's the difference if it's in Eretz Yisrael? Chutzlar, it's contagious, it's contagious. For example, this din the Gemara Moed Katan of Zayin says that a chassan during the days of his Sheva Brachas or during Yom Tif, a kohen is not royas and negi, doesn't see negis. He says, essentially what we're encouraging is super spreader events. A chassan by his own wedding, when he's going to shake hands and hug hundreds of people, or someone on Yom Tif who's going to meet his entire extended family who's coming to be El Regel and then is going to redisperse through all the length and breadth of Eretz Yisrael. These are the times that Chazal say a kohen is not roya the negi. He says, how does that make sense if you're talking about contagion? If you're talking about contagion, it's ipchum mistaver. These are exactly the times that you should be concerned about contagion. So, and this goes on for pages and pages and pages of these rayas till he comes to the conclusion, and this is the conclusion of most I would say achronim, is that leprosy has nothing to do with Tzaraas. Tzaraas is a spiritual disease. It's a special chiddush that the Torah that Hashem gave and created for particular circumstances, and it has nothing to do with the very common and easily spread disease called leprosy. Now, so what is Tzaraas? What is the spiritual underpinning of Tzaraas? So the Gemara in Erechon and Tesvav Beis, in a famous Gemara that's discussing the seriousness of lashon hara, the Gemara brings interesting thing. The Gemara says, Amar Shlakish Ma'idach Siv Zeis Teres Zeis Tia Teres HaMetzayra. What does it mean Zeis Tia Teres HaMetzayra? Zeis Tia Terase Shal Moitzi Shemra. Metzayra is an amalgamated word. It's a word that's really comprised of Moitzi Shemra. Metzayra is Moitzi Shemra crunched up. Zeis Tia Teres Moitzi Shemra. This will be the Torah of Moitzi Shemra. Then the Gemara says Kama Gadol Ein Shel Lashon Hara, and the Gemara continues the famous mashal with the Nachash, etc. And from this we know, and Chavetz Chaim brings this in the Akdam to Sefer Shemiras HaLashon, that Ba'avoyin Lashon Hara, people get Tzaraas, and the Chavetz Chaim is Matmiya Grada in Sefer Zechira, that L'cheira Lashon Hara is not on the decline, but Tzaraas is on the decline. So how those two graphs, line up with each other. People don't say less Lashon Hara than they did back in the day, but there's much less Tzaraas than there was back in the day, so he wants to figure out how that works, etc. In the Nevi'im, there's only, I think, in Tanakh, I think there's I think 5 times that Tzaraas appears. Moshe Rabbeinu has Tzaraas as one of the Simanim. Miriam gets Tzaraas when she speaks negatively about Moshe Rabbeinu, which the Gemara says makes the diik that even Miriam, who only had good intentions and didn't even really think she was doing anything wrong, still got Tzaraas. Alachas kam v'kama, someone who means to do something wrong. And then there's Naaman, who was not a Jew. Uzio, I think, and I'm missing one more. What did you say? Arba Mitzrayim, but it doesn't have names, right? That's true. I mean, there's a 4th one who has a name. There's 5 named Mitzrayim throughout Tanakh, I think. I'm wrong. Could be there's more. As I looked at Kaf. And all of those are, each one's its own story, and it presents a little differently, and the refuah is a little different, and etc. Now, the Rambam, in the end of Hilchas Tumas Tzaraas, in Perek Tesvav, he has like a whole, it's like a Musar shtickle, a whole long, the last shtickle in Halacha Yud. He has a whole like Musar piece, and he says, Tzaraasi Shem Ha'amr B'Shutvis, Koil Yanim Har B'Shein Daimon Zelazeh. Tzaraas is a Shem HaKoil. It's a catch-all type of name. It includes many different ailments and illnesses and presentations. For example, and then he goes in some of the examples, Nige Batim, Nige Begadim, the Nesek, and other types of Nigam. And then he says as follows. 1 second. He says, so Tzaraas comes as a warning. Someone who's Misapel Lashon, first his walls change. If he does tshuva, his house comes back to how it was. He says if he doesn't, and they destroy his house because of the Tzaraas, then his personal effects, his begadim and his things that he lay on, get Tzaraas. They become tar. Until finally gets to him. He says, here's what the Rambam says. The Torah is telling you, pay attention to what happened to Miriam and Aviyah. She spoke about her brother Moshe Rabbeinu, who she was his older sister. She took care of him. She put herself in danger to save his life. And she didn't even say anything bad about him. She didn't really say anything bad. She just made an error that she compared him to all other Nevi'im and held him to the standard of other Nevi'im. And Moshe Rabbeinu himself didn't even take it personal. He wasn't even upset about it. Shenemar ve'ish Moshe anav ma'id. V'afal pikein miyad nensha b'tzarasa kavachayim l'bnei adam harashayim atipshim shemarbim l'daber gedolos v'neflois lefichach roilim mishareitz l'chavan archaisav l'srachik me'shivasan im l'daber yimon kadei shelitvas adam b'reshes v'shalom v'sachlusam. Now the Rambam in this part I got like a big kick out of. He gives it like a description of how shmuzerai gets you in trouble. He says as follows: V'zed derech yeshivas haleitzim harasham. This is the normal shmuzing pattern. He says. First, people just schmooze about nothing. They just waste time. They talk about nothing. The natural outcropping of that is they come to talk about the gnus of the tzaddikim. Eventually, there's no cutoff point, and they talk bad even about Nevi'im. And then eventually, Mili says Tzaraas is to warn a person to avoid this. So the Rambam gives like a musar shmooze about like a kiddush gone rogue. How sitting around the shmoozing leads to bad things. And Mili says Tzaraas is built as a reminder to avoid that. Now, in any case, this is the so to speak the ruchnistic underpinning of Tzaraas. Tzaraas is an einish, and it's like a ruchnistic einish. Now, the question is, like the Chafetz Chaim observed, like the Chafetz Chaim pointed out, is Tzaraas gone? Is it not applicable b'zman anymore? Is Tzaraas not available? Like what happened to Tzaraas? Tzaraas, the Torah spends a very, very lengthy description describing Tzaraas, talking about it in detail. And then today, seemingly, when's the last time we met a Mitzayra? So there's a very interesting little tidbit in the Sefer Toldos Adam that I want to mention over here. The Toldos Adam is written about Rav Zalman of Volozhiner. Rav Zalman of Volozhiner was Rav Chaim Volozhiner's younger brother. I think he was 8 years younger than Rav Chaim Volozhiner. He was born supposedly from a brach of the Shakas Aryeh. The Shakas Aryeh was a Rav in Volozhin, certainly at some point. The last, I think, 20 years of the Shakas Aryeh's career, he was a Rav in Metz, in Alsace, France. But the Shakas Aryeh lived into his 90s, so he had a very long rabbinic career. And earlier in his life, he was a Rav in Volozhin. And the Rav Chaim Volozhiner and some of his brothers learned or had to do with the Shagas Aryeh. Rav Chaim Volozhiner's father, Yitzchak Volozhiner, was close to him, and he got a bracha from the Shagas Aryeh. And I think his ben Zechunim was Rav Zalmula Volozhiner. Rav Chaim Volozhiner had several brothers. He had a brother of Binyamin, he had a brother of Zalmula, Rav Shlomo Zalman. He himself, I think he had an older brother. Rav Chaim Volozhiner had many brothers, but he had this younger brother, Zalmula Volozhiner, who was like a Kaddish Mirechem and like a special type of Eloi. They say about him that he was making brachas from the time he was, a few months old. He had a memory that was supposed to be something off the chart. By his low 20s, he supposedly knew Shas, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifri, Sifrat, Tesefta, Mechilta, Teres Kayanim, V'chulu Bal Peh. Even though the Gaon who Rav Zalmula and Rav Chaim Volozhiner learned by was against memorizing the memorizing things, the Gaon wanted always to chazer inside. Rav Zalmula Volozhiner had some sort of incredible memory. A story is told that he was once by the Gaon, and the Gaon was saying something, and the Gaon said, "Bring me a Masechtas Nazir. I want to look up the sugya that we're mentioning." Now, obviously, the Gaon didn't need to look it up inside; he could have said it by heart, but it was more of like a hashkafa, not to always say it by heart. And the Gaon held that if you say it always by heart, it leads to toyos mishrashes. Like if you make a mistake once, that mistake becomes like certified because you never circle back to it. So the guy always made encourage him to look back. And he looked while they were waiting for the Nazir. He looked around the room and he saw Rav Zalmula Volozhiner, who was probably a teenager, sitting there with like a pick me expression on his face, like Rabbi, I could do this. I don't And he says, "Nu Zalmula zagme the sugya Nazir." And Rav Zalmula said it over the whole sugya in front of the guy, which I think sounds like a non-story because he knew it by heart. But he said, but if you're sitting in front of the guy who asked for a Gemara and to offer to say it over in front of him, if you put it into context and you really imagine the characters at the table, it becomes quite a story. Rav Zalmula was makbid, for example, that he didn't ever ask for anything that was in Yonah D'Alma, any food, clothing. He would always say a halacha, a pasuk, a medrash that was relevant to the thing, and you'd have to hope that his attendants were Talmidei Chacham enough to understand what he wanted. And he wouldn't talk about something mundane, b'chlal. Now Rav Zalmula Volozhiner is like a star that never fully rose because he dies at 31 years old, 31, 32. He dies very young. Unclear what he dies from, and his patira itself is a few pages in the Sefer Toldos Adam describing it. And after he was nifter, they put out a Sefer Toldos Adam which describes his. It's a very interesting type of biography. It's a biography, but it's a very Torani biography. His tremendous memory and different things that he said, anecdotes, quips, makairis, marmakaimis, things that he said, and a lot of it is based on recollections that Rav Chaim Volozhiner, his older brother, said over. Now, in Toldos Adam in Chelik Beis, there's a story that Rav Chaim Volozhiner brings as follows. He says as follows. One second. Rav Chaim Volozhiner says like this. He says, Siperli Rav Chaim Achiv, the author of the biography he's writing, says, Rav Chaim, his brother, told me, Pamachas zarcha Tzaraas ktana al regel atzadik. Once there was a small Tzaraas. Now, you're talking about people who, Tzaraas is a very complicated sugya to know and isolate what exactly Tzaraas is, what it actually looks like, and we'll see that a little later. But they say it matter of fact. Rav Chaim Volozhiner said, Pamachas zarcha Tzaraas ktana al regel atzadik. There was a small Tzaraas lesion on the foot of the tzaddik. The doctor looked him over. He was mispoinin it. The doctor observed this lesion on the foot of Rav Zalmula Volozhiner, and he said the proper course of treatment is to cut off this lesion and to eviscerate the flesh underneath it, which is a very primitive form of dealing with like a cancerous lesion on a foot or whatever. To cut it off and to eviscerate the flesh underneath it to try to stop the spread of whatever it is. And he says that's what the doctor encouraged. Rav Zalmula answered, "V'amar hini yesh li mevucha b'zeh. Ru'at Tzaraas mara beheres yeshla." I could see that this lesion has it looks like a beheres to me. And my opinion is that the isser of tzitzas beheres, of cutting off beheres, is negei even bizman hazeh. And then Rav Zalmula spent a long time saying pilpul about the sugya. As far as yisharis, v'adina maklulim behilchas eila, kulam ha'eruchim mishmurim aluach liba, mishinanam al piv, v'yachrishu kulam kilem etzom mana. And Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, the sitting around, no one had anything to say. Rav Zalmula said, this looks like a beheres, and then he launched into a shir klali about beheres and tzitzas beheres bizman hazeh and the nigei ar and how they look and what they did, chulu. He says nobody had anything to say and they just left. Now I don't know. To me, I have no idea to know. I don't know. We don't know what the real diagnosis of this lesion is. if it went away, I think he says it went away. It says, "V'hinei apilpul hayakush shloi nevad meitana avra achilash and ator v'shulchan aruch v'zel sheinei." 1 second. V'hinei b'chamlasei heitziyah min achali azel l'revaya b'li tachbul sareifel haris boy ki kolam mistafchem b'nachlas Hashem teirasei pri b'tchayim yeichelu. Rabbi Chaim Volozhin says that eventually it went away on its own and healed on its own to show that someone who has betachin will get the refuah that he deserves. Hagam Grada Reb Zalman Volozhin on his deathbed at 31 years old, wistfully remarked, advice to I wasn't such a big tzaddik because a big tzaddik wouldn't die, wouldn't need a doctor. When there was doctors inside, he said a big tzaddik wouldn't need a doctor, like this the Ramban, he quoted Ramban, which if we go into the sugi more in depth, we'll get into eventually. Just a very tragic description of his death at 31 years old. In any case, this is this is one of the most current and recent occurrences of Tzaraas that's documented. Meaning, the problem with documenting current Tzaraas is that most people don't know what Tzaraas is. If you take a Mishnayos Negoim and Tosefta and Teres Kainim and etc., it's beyond complicated with the Rambam, whatever, and it's very, very complicated to know what Tzaraas is. So most people can't certify with any actual veracity that what they're looking at is Tzaraas. So this is one of the most recently documented cases of somebody saying Tzaraas b'zman hazeh. So now from Reb Zalman it sounds like it could exist, it does exist, and all the Isurim of Kaitzis B'harasai and all the Dinim and the mitzvahs of Tzaraas still seem to apply b'zman hazeh according to Reb Zalman's description. Now the shaila is, so how come we don't see more of this? What happened to it? How come we don't have any din Tzaraas? Now, if you take a look in Shulchan Aruch, in all the Al-Chag Shulchan Aruch, there's no Hilchas Tzaraas. Kayidua, the Shulchan Aruch writes only halachas that negay b'zman hazeh, and therefore, since Tzaraas seemingly the Shulchan Aruch held is not negay b'zman hazeh, there are no Hilchas Tzaraas. The Rambam, on the other hand, in Taira has Hilchas Tumas Tzaraas because the Rambam writes things that even Hilchas al-Mashicha, the Rambam has Karbanis, the Rambam has Taira, right? The Rambam has all the halachas that were not negay b'zman hazeh, in the hope that they will be negay whenever they are negay. In Shulchan Aruch, there are no such halachas of Hilchas Tzaraas. Now, what's interesting is that there are 2 times, really 3, but 2.5 times that the Shulchan Aruch mentions Tzaraas, Ladina, which implies that maybe the Shulchan Aruch Tzaraas could exist. They're as follows. The Shulchan Aruch in Hilchas Mila, in Siman Reish Samach Vav, based on a Sugya Arucha and Shabbos and Daf Kuf Lamed Beis, that discusses someone who has a baby who's born with Tzaraas on the Makkah Mila. And the Shaila is, are you allowed to give a Mila to such a baby? Is it considered Kaitzis B'harasai? Sugya Eser Deichalois say, what takes precedence? Lav say, Mila, not Mila B'zmanim, Mishalei B'zmanim. It's a whole long Arichas, an Amud and a half a Gemara in Shabbos. And the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchas Mila and Siman Reish Samach Vav brings down this din of giving a Mila to a baby who has Tzaraas. Additionally, the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Lamed Ches, in Hilchas Tefillin, the end of Hilchas Tefillin, in Lamed Ches and Siman Sif Yud Gimel, Shulchan Aruch says that a Mitzayra is usher to wear tefillin. Menuda and Mitzayra usher l'ilbish tefillin. Menuda and Mitzayra, that's a very practical halacha the Shulchan Aruch is bringing down about a very zman hazedik halacha about a Mitzayra and saying they don't wear tefillin. Now, rather the Mishabur brings down and that the Gain and Mishabur doesn't bring down the Baal Tanya, but the Baal Tanya as well. The Gain, the Baal Tanya, and others are chaylik on this din and say we paskin that a Mitzayra does put on tefillin. They don't even hold like this din in Shulchan Aruch. But the Shulchan Aruch is bringing down this din about a Mitzayra putting on tefillin, not putting on tefillin, which again implies that it's somewhat of a modern day occurrence. But by and large in the Shulchan Aruch there is no organized section called Hilchas Tzaraas. That's not brought down widely b'chlal. And if you look in the Chuvas, like throughout the Chuvas of the Deiris, there's very, very mamish, a whisper of Chuvas about Tzaraas. Very, very few and far in between. There is a Chuva in the Marit, in Chelik Beis, in Even Ezer, in Siman Yudalid. It has a whole Chuva about a woman demanding a divorce because her husband has Tzaraas. That's a din, that a woman whose husband is Ma'asala could demand a divorce, like a Menuvel Mukashchin, and he handles what is the exact symptoms of Tzaraas. He quotes a Chuva from the Re'im, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrachi, and other Chuvas, but that's like a one-off tshuva that's very rare. He rather compares it to the Gemara in Pesachim, Daf Ayin Vav, and the Gemara in Ksubas and Daf Samach Vav, the Balei Rasan and Davar Acher. It's an interesting tshuva, but again, not so much negei halacha l'maisa, but a tshuva that exists. Where there is a tshuva that talks about l'maisa is the Shelis Yavitz. Rabbi Yaakov Emden in Chelik Aleph and Tshuva Kuf Lamed Vav, he has a tshuva where he's handling what would be about Tzaraas b'zman hazeh. Is there a mitzvah to deal with it? Do we deal with it? Does it exist? Does it not exist? He brings, and he's the one who opens up the idea of saying terutzim. Now, Lamaisa, if you really look back, it's an earlier machlekes. Seems to be a stira in Chazal already between the Psikta and the Tosefta. The Tosefta brings a story, and the story is brought down in a few different places where Reb Tarfon, who was sitting with, I forgot who, and Reb Tarfon says, "Pass me makli, my stick." And when the Talmud, I think it's Reb Yehuda, passes him the stick, Reb Tarfon says, "Bezet tiharti gimel mitzayram." With this stick, I was mitara 3 mitzayram. Now, Reb Tarfon lived after the Zman HaBayis. It's already in what we would call, in regards to our conversation, the modern era, because it was after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed already, and he's saying Bezer Tiharti. Now, Lamaisa, Rav Tarfon probably still had Efer Para. He was still living in Eretz Yisrael, and it was possible to do a real Taras Mitzera. They still had the Mitzera of what exactly Tzaraas looked like, and they were able to do it. But over time, it disappeared. So what happened? So the Chazon Ish in the end of Nagam and Semid Gimel, the Chazon Ish writes, he makes a dig in the Rambam and the Chinuch, and he says it like matter of fact. He says, "Af bezman hazeh, af she'en lanu taras, v'taras mitzera, af she'en lanu taras mitzera chayva, afilu l'man d'lasli tefillah b'zman ha-mitzvah." Chazon Ish says, matter of factly, Tzaraas still exists b'zman hazeh, and then he goes off into like a whole chakira about how to deal with it and whatever. Now, so what really happened? Like, why? Where'd it go? What meaning? If it seems like in Chazal and the Rishonim, the Rambam, the Chinuch, and etc., that Tzaraas exists b'zman hazeh, so what happened? Where'd it go? So there is a tshuva from the Ga'inim in Tshuvas HaGa'inim in Simon Kuf Ayin Vav in Shari Tshuva. There's a tshuva from a Ga'in. I think it's from a Churnai Ga'in, but I could be wrong. He brings like a Messiah. So it says, Anshe Mizrach, Einam Tovlim, Loi mi Keri, V'loi mi Tashmish, Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, and Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, Einam Menugaim Mitamin. Tzaraas, the Menugaim are not Mitamin anymore, Mishachar Beis HaMikdash. B'zman hazeh, Chas v'shalom, Yeh Talmud, a Chacham Mitzera, if there be a Talmud or a Chacham who has Tzaraas, Ein doichen ois aloim beis haknesses v'loim beis hamedrash the leka hashta v'haya machanech HaKadosh. There's no b'zman hazeh v'haya machanech HaKadosh. Now, the Tshuvas HaGa'inim was opening up the idea that we're not noyig to deal with Tzaraas anymore. He doesn't say why. He says because there's no din of v'haya machanech HaKadosh, which refers to machan levi and machan kuna, which don't exist anymore, but really has nothing to do, it's not a sufficient resolution to the rest of Ilchas Tzaraas that should be negeya. But the tshuva from the Ga'inim, from Rabbi Riturnai Ga'inim is saying that b'zman hazeh we don't have the anhag of Tzaraas. Now, what's interesting is that the Tzaraas Yisrael, in his Hakdama to Masechtas Nagaim, I forgot what it's called, the little Hakdama has a name there, he writes, Mi'oidi tamati, miyamim tamati, what happened to Tzaraas? How come we're not knowing the dinim of Tzaraas? Says there's still dinim, priya, prima, iser tashmish, staying away from people, not going into Yerushalayim. There's still dinim that should be applicable to Tzaraas. Says Me'oidi tamati, what happened with Tzaraas? Says and miyamai. Back in the day, he says, when I was a young bacher, I asked my Reinu Rabbi Akiva, that's Rabbi Kveger, the Tzaraas Yisrael grew up in Posen in Kveger city. He says, I asked my Reinu Rabbi Akiva, I think who's Shlita still when he wrote that Kovetz, and he told me, it's a good question, I don't have an answer. Now, there's not a lot of things I think that, there's plenty of Tzarchi and Gadol that Rabbi Kveger left unanswered, but there's not a lot of shilas you could ask Rabbi Kveger, I think, where he would say, I don't know the answer, I don't know why. Rabbi Kveger was asked this by the Tzaraas Yisrael as a young man or as a bacher, what happened to Tzaraas, how come I don't know you're going to dinim? He says, I don't know the answer. Now, the Tzaraas Yisrael says, that was when I was a kid. Achsha, now that I got older, I have pshat, he says, and he brings a pshat. Now, amongst the Marsham in Chelik Gimel has a pshat, the Radvaz in Hilchos Trumas has a pshat, and I'll just briefly run through some of the pshatim that I said. One way or the other. The Lamashal, the Radvaz says, Bismana that we don't have Kehanim Miyuchasim, we don't have any Kehanim Miyuchasim, and since you don't have a Kohen Miyuchas, and part of the Taras Tzaraas requires shaving of the head, which is an Isser, you're not allowed to shave payas and etc. And since it's going to be you don't have a Kohen Miyuchas, you can't do it. Others say we don't have the Shni Selas that's necessary for the mixture. We don't know what color that is. Others say we don't have a Messiah on the Nagaim anymore. We lost our Messiah. We don't know anymore what exactly they look like. And the Chazal say, Kol she'enei baki in the Daled Nagaim, shouldn't say a word about it. It's like one of those sugyas where if you don't know everything, don't say anything. Now, why that is unclear, but as is, that's halachas. Meaning, because of these, lapses in the Messiah or missing details as to what it is, we don't pass in the shilas anymore. Now, Lamaisa, because of this, and even if there's not a great reason for it, and I saw Meir Mazoz in a tshuva that he wrote, they asked him, how come there's no Tzaraas on Hazeh, expecting him to have an answer, and he said, if Kvegi says he doesn't know, you think I know better than everybody else? If nobody knew, nobody knows. I don't know either. Well, I don't know what happened to it. It's gone. We don't have it anymore. For whatever the reason is, it's gone. We don't have it anymore. Now, there is though mahalach, let's say, in the Rishonim and Achronim, that would seem to imply that Tzaraas is gone. Not that we don't know how to deal with it, or we don't know how to recognize it, or we don't know how to treat it, but that it's gone. It really starts with the Rashbam al Torah, but the Alshich in Parshas Tazria says it much more explicitly, and I want to read you what the Alshich says. The Alshich says like this: it says, "B'yamim Rishonim, hayu bnei adam tovim." People were good. So when they were good, they were on an elevated, on a lofty level, they saw Negaim. Back in the day, when they were Tovim and Shleim and Avodas Hashem, if they became nislachach, dirtied by the Chet of Lashon Hara, the body was like physically repulsed by the tumah of Lashon Hara and the tumah that was imposed on it. It was physically repulsed. The body would kick it out on its own, and that would represent itself as like a physical ailment that would show up on the skin, some sort of disease that would show up. We're not that halig that tumah should have such a visceral reaction. Tumah with the rest of us is not really chaytzit, so the body doesn't kick it out anymore, the body doesn't push it out, so Tzaraas doesn't show itself anymore. Adam a mensch, like a proper mensch, a mensch with all the shleimus of the mensch, that's someone who has Tzaraas. But just someone who's just, coasting like all of us is not going to have Tzaraas anymore. So the Alshich seems to be the one, and it's really based on a Seforno and a Rashbam and others that seem to say this, that Tzaraas is a very delicate spiritual ailment, and it only shows itself when a person's leading his life on a very, very pristine level, which would make sense that Reb Zalman of Alazhner, A, would have the know-how to diagnose the Tzaraas, and B, be an appropriate candidate to get Tzaraas. Meaning, the more halikite, the more Kaddish B'Rachim a person is the more viable it is that he could possibly have Tzaraas. Meaning, a regular average person, Bisman wouldn't have Tzaraas b'chal, but some sort of, elevated, super miyuchad person, a one-of-a-kind type of person could maybe potentially have Tzaraas. Now, if it actually is negay, not as I saw Shilas of Nassing Stetner and Laharis Nassan as a whole tshuva, Rabbi Yashiv, Rav Chaim, they were asked about different things. I just want to read you a small sampling. I'm not going to break my teeth too much, but there's a small sampling of what potentially Tzaraas could be. If Tzaraas is not leprosy, what are the modern diseases that are available that have some of the symptoms of Tzaraas? Now, this is a doctor who wrote a rabbi doctor. His name is Sodi Namir. He wrote an article in Asya, which is like a Torah medical journal. And he gave a long list, and they're in English, but that's not of much use to me because I can't read most of them, about various different illnesses, like 2.5 pages long, of various illnesses that show some symptoms of Tzaraas. For example, Addison's disease, chemical leukoderma, halonevius, I don't know if anybody knows what these are, idiopathic hemomelanosis, malignant melanoma, that I think I've heard of. And many more. There's like lists and lists, syphilis, tenocaplus, I can't, lists and lists of various ones based on the symptoms that the Torah describes that could present as Tzaraas. Now, the nafkamina would be, if someone le'aleinu has one of these diseases, is there nisr to be kaitzitz b'harasai? Meaning, if you hold like the deis that Tzaraas exists and it's just hard to diagnose, we just don't know. So maybe like misafik is a nisr of kaitzitz b'harasai. You're not allowed to treat it, and this the Laharis Nassan talks about, or not. How do we hold? Now, the primary shaila where this is actually negeya is, and this no one should take this the wrong way, but one of the most matching diseases that match the symptoms of Tzaraas is male pattern baldness. Very, very common in men. Men losing their hair is one of the most easily applicable symptoms of Tzaraas that match. Nesek, which describes baldness, is a big machlekes rishonim, and I'm not going to get into the 3 machlekes rishonim, but the Ravid on his in Pirush and Teres Kainim, and the Ravid is considered like the standard bearer when it comes to Teres Kainim, seems to learn Nesek is pashut baldness without any change in the skin color. No discoloration of the skin, just losing the hair in one in the location, like in a full location, is already Tzaraas. Now, would it be usher for a person to take creams or to have a hair transplant or to do laser treatments to regrow? Meaning, are these things considered kaitzis b'harasei? I saw langa tshuva. The short answer is no, obviously, but langa tshuva discussing this halacha. All the shittas rishonim. Someone asked Chaim Kanievsky about it. Chaim Kanievsky said that it's midei safek leyatza. It's probably not Tzaraas. Like he was not impressed with the day that says it is or it isn't. But it's just interesting to think that something so prevalent, so common is the thing. Now, according to the shittas that say Tzaraas is gone, just to circle back to this, Chafetz Chaim had that kasha that Lashon Hara isn't gone, so why would Tzaraas be gone? So the Chafetz Chaim says that Anias is b'makom Tzaraas, and Anias is taka very prevalent. That didn't go away. It says Ani chashav kameis and Mitzayris chashav kameis. So it's tzad hashava, and therefore Hashem replaced Tzaraas with Anias. That's what Chafetz Chaim says. In any case, whether it exists or doesn't exist, or whether these some relatively common medical conditions are Tzaraas is an open question, to be continued with something loosely related to this, not directly related.